welcome today Lucian Kim. Lucian is a senior analyst on Ukraine at the International Crisis Group in Washington, D.C. He's also a journalist. In fact, he has covered Ukraine, Russia, Eastern Europe for more than 20 years now. At one point, he was based in Berlin and also in Moscow. And very recently, he was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., where he started to write his book. And this wonderful book has just been published. It's called Putin's Revenge, Why Russia Invaded Ukraine. It was published by Columbia University Press in New York just some weeks ago. And this book, which I had the great pleasure to read as soon as it was out, is really an excellent book that will tell us much more about the last 20 years. In fact, we start with the Bush administration, with the Orange Revolution in Kyiv, and then we see all these developments and Maidan, and the American presidents who keep changing, and then the Soviet president. No, it's a lapsus I made. It was not voluntary on my part, but still, the Russian president, Putin, who has been here for the last 25 years. And in this book, we discover all these figures and the scene that is developing. And Lucian explains us with wonderful sources and also many field work what has happened over the last 20 years. And really, I'm sure that in the Q&A part following Lucian's presentation, we will speak about the last days, the last weeks, and possibly the future. But really, when you think about the last 10, 20 years and read this book, you have so many new keys to understand today. That's why this book is so important, is so well written. And we are so happy, Lucian, that you have been able to come through Switzerland and that we can welcome you here at the university. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Gilles. So thank you again, Gilles, and thank you for this warm welcome. The book indeed recently came out, and this is my second book presentation outside of the United States. I had my first international book presentation in Kyiv last Wednesday, and this is the first one in Switzerland. And of course, this is a very dear place for me because my mother is from Zurich, and I am half Swiss, and I have a cousin here as well supporting me. So it's really a great honor to be speaking in Lausanne today. I would like to say a few words about my own background, why I decided to write this book, a little bit about some background about the book itself, describe the main ideas, and then I think the most important thing, or the most interesting thing, is of course a discussion. So then Gilles and I will have a short discussion, and then your questions are the most important thing. I met Gilles not so long ago in September in Kyiv. We were at the same conference, and it was a very intense few days in an underground conference hall. And so this was it was really a wonderful meeting. And so when I found out that as an analyst for Crisis Group, I was going to be in Bern, I immediately wrote to Gilles and asked him if I could also present my book in Lausanne. And this is how all came together. I also have a connection to Lausanne because I studied French here many years ago, not at the university, but at the at the Migros school. Unfortunately, this talk will be in English. My French is really very, very rusty. So, as Gilles said, I've spent my career as a journalist working out of Berlin and Moscow for more than 20 years. So first in Berlin, I started my career, then I went to Moscow, and then back to Berlin and Moscow, so really alternating. And I left Moscow in August 2021 with my family. We moved to Washington. We did not know for how long, but we went to Washington because I had a fellowship from the Wilson Center, and I had a plan to write a book, something more like a memoir. And then, of course, I was there just a few months, and Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. My instinct as a journalist was, of course, to go there. Also, my instinct as a friend to many Ukrainians, and as someone who had been following Ukraine for many years. Actually, my first visit to Ukraine was exactly 20 years ago in 2005. So this was my instinct to go. And I remember I was speaking with a friend. It's in the I describe it in the introduction of my book. I was speaking to a friend, a Ukrainian friend, who had to flee Kiev, and she was in a house outside of Kiev with her husband and with her small son, who's the same age as our boy. And she was asking me, what should I do? Should we run to the border, or should we stay where we are? And because driving on the roads in Ukraine was also very dangerous. There were bandits. And nobody understood the situation. Yeah, there was no good information. Or stay in the same place. And I mean, there were Russians all around, and they were at the gates of Kiev. And it was the most difficult question that anybody had ever asked me. Should I run to the border, or should I stay where I am? What do you think? And she asked me, what do you think? And I was sitting comfortably in Washington, D.C., and I felt very deeply for my friends there. And I remember that my friend, her name is Tanya, she told me, this is your time. You need to talk to the world. You need to say what's going on here. You know. And I realized that at this moment, my best contribution, sitting far away in Washington in a safe place, was to write about what I know and what I saw with my own eyes, and that's how the conflict started. And this is the subject of this book. It begins, as Gilles said, in 2005 with the Orange Revolution, which was a people power revolution. I really see the Orange Revolution as a continuation of the peaceful revolutions in Central Europe, in Berlin, in East Berlin, and in the East German cities, Leipzig and Dresden, and in Prague, the Velvet Revolution in Prague. I see that what happened in Ukraine in 2005 as a continuation. Of course, Vladimir Putin had a very different interpretation of the Orange Revolution, which was completely peaceful, a peaceful protest against a rigged election. But Vladimir Putin's interpretation of the Orange Revolution was that the West was expanding its influence, and that they were coming closer and closer to Moscow, and that they wanted to start this kind of revolution in Moscow itself and overthrow his government. So this is the beginning of the book. The book has 11 chapters, and I examine what was happening in Ukraine, what was happening at the same time in Russia, because the domestic situation in Russia is very important to understand the Russian foreign policy. And I also spent quite a lot of time looking at the US foreign policy. What was the US doing? It's something that I had been observing for a long time, and I knew that there were already in the West many people, and certainly in the Kremlin, who said that NATO was to blame for this war. So I wanted to examine also what exactly was NATO doing, what were Western countries doing, especially the United States. And the book ends then with the eve of the war, February 24th, 2022. So I did not talk about what happened since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. I tried to find a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I have colleagues that are in the field, that are working in the field, and they've written books, great books, but the books end, you know, whenever the book was published and without any conclusion. So I felt it was important to tell the prehistory, yeah, the origin story of this war. So the book is called Putin's Revenge: Why Russia Invaded Ukraine. And I've heard some criticism of this title, especially the beginning, Putin's Revenge. Why Putin? Why revenge? I think, in my opinion, the word revenge doesn't mean that you did anything bad necessarily. Someone can want revenge on you even if you did nothing. But if this person took offense at what you said. And I think when I use the word revenge, I really mean Putin wanted revenge on Ukrainian people, for choosing a way that was different from the Moscow way. He wanted the Ukrainian people, although Ukraine was very divided, a new generation of Ukrainians wanted to move to the West and to join Europe. I think it was also revenge against the West, of course. It was for the humiliation that people of Putin's generation, and I don't think only his generation, but also his professional group, the KGB, the humiliation they felt at the end of the Cold War. I think most people in Western Europe were very happy when the Cold War ended. They were inspired by the protests in East Germany and in Czechoslovakia. But of course, Vladimir Putin at that time, excuse me, was a KGB officer in East Germany. And he had, of course, a very different view of what was happening. He describes himself how when these people power revolutions were taking place in Eastern Europe, you know, they called Moscow for instructions, and nobody picked up the phone in Moscow. And I think it was this feeling that there was a great superpower that had hundreds of thousands of troops in the Warsaw Bloc was unable to even put down a few protests. And I think in that sense, it was Putin's revenge against the humiliation that he and his fellow officers in the security agencies felt, and in that sense, almost revenge against history, yeah, against the course of history. So, and I call it Putin's revenge because it is a very personalized. First of all, it's a personalist system where one man makes a lot of decisions, and I think Putin felt this offense very deeply. It's something that we can talk about later as well. The subtitle of the book is Why Russia Invaded Ukraine. So I will give you a spoiler, and spoiler alert, because now I will tell you, I will give you the answer to the question why he invaded Ukraine. I see two fundamental reasons why he did it. The first reason is Russian imperialism, or we could say also the legacy of Russian imperialism. And Russian imperialism, by Russian imperialism, I mean this idea, which is very old, that Russia has a historic mission to be the center of a huge Eurasian empire, and that it is its mission and its duty to have this sort of civilization of its own. And the idea that Ukraine, of course, is a key part of that empire. That Russia without Ukraine it cannot be an empire. It's also something that that geostrategists in the West I'm thinking of the former national security advisor in the US, Brzezinski, who famously said that Russia cannot be an empire unless it has Ukraine in it. And it certainly, I think the Russians felt very strongly that he was right. And well, the other point I wanted to make was on this legacy of imperialism is that, of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet Union broke into 15 different states, and even though some of these states had very weak traditions of statehood, most of these countries and most of these people had an idea that they wanted to have their own country, that they wanted to be their own state. And I think in Russia especially, it was a very difficult time because Russia as a country was so tied to an empire. And so to take a critical stance towards Soviet history was very difficult because Russian history was so closely intertwined with Soviet history or with the imperial history. So it was very hard to break, to make a break with the Soviet past. It was much more difficult for Russians than Estonians or Georgians or people living in Central Asia. So that's the first reason, this idea of Russian imperialism. But I think just this idea of Russian imperialism alone is, of course, not enough to start an invasion against your neighbor. There needs to be a second ingredient, and I think this ingredient is Putin's dictatorship. Yeah? When Vladimir Putin came into power, it's hard to, when you said, Gilles, 25 years, it really surprised me. But now, 25 years ago, he was not thinking of, in 22 years I will invade Ukraine. Of course not. When Vladimir Putin came into power, many people saw him as a modernizer. He spoke of Russia possibly joining NATO. We don't know how serious he was, but he at least entertained the possibility that Russia could join NATO, and it looked like that Russia was really moving towards Europe. He set as a goal Russia reaching the per capita GDP of Portugal. And so it was a very Western-oriented idea. Russia was open for business. Russia experienced an unprecedented economic boom thanks to the oil prices that were going up. And Russia looked like it was joining the world community. But the longer that Putin stayed in power, the more he became convinced that the West, and especially the United States, was interested in overthrowing him. And I would say he became more and more paranoid the longer that he stayed in power, and as he looked what was happening in the rest of the world. First of all, he saw the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the so-called Rose Revolution in Georgia, and the Arab Spring. And for him, the Arab Spring was just a continuation of what the Russians called colored revolutions, that the United States was spreading its influence and trying to undermine governments, even if they were very autocratic, throughout the world. And so he saw himself as the ultimate target of these revolutions. And this is one of the, I think, his dictatorship became harder and harder. He stayed in power longer and longer, and we should not underestimate the role that COVID played, because when COVID, the pandemic started, he became extremely isolated. He's a real germaphobe, and he locked himself up in some of his palaces and saw very few advisors. And he began to have a very small circle of people to talk with. And finally, when we get to 2022, there were, of course, a number of factors that led Putin to finally decide to start this war. I think he felt, first and foremost, he felt that he was going to turn 70 in October 2022. And I think he felt that this was, the clock was ticking. And for Putin, anniversaries, including his birthday, are very important days. Researching this book, I was always very surprised that certain holidays take on a special meaning for Putin. And he saw his own 70th birthday coming up, and he was thinking very much about his own historical legacy. And he realized he could be remembered in history as the Russian leader who lost Ukraine, or he could be the Russian leader who reconquered Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this is why he chose the second option. He felt after years of arming and reforming the Russian military that the Russian military was very strong. He had seen a lot of military successes, especially in Syria. Although the Syrian war was, of course, very different from what happened in Ukraine. But he felt that the military was ready. Russia had $600 billion in reserves, foreign reserves, and in gold. And he felt this was the moment, the moment that he could strike. There are, of course, factors also that were happening in Ukraine, and we can discuss those in greater detail if you're interested. But in the end, he saw this as a unique opportunity. In Germany, there was a new government forming. France was facing new elections, and Joe Biden's administration was also not, first of all, they had the debacle of the Afghanistan withdrawal, and it seemed like a good opportunity to take this kind of action. As I mentioned before, what's very important to me researching this book was also to look at what role the West played. Because there are many people, especially in Europe and also in the United States, they tend to be more on the far left and the far right who believe in this idea. Although now we have a president in the United States who also says NATO was to blame, so it's actually maybe become very mainstream, this idea that NATO carries responsibility. I think the West, I drew the conclusion that the West, of course, the West does bear some responsibility, not for the invasion, but for their treatment of Ukraine. And so I start with the Orange Revolution, and this was a time when George W. Bush was in power in the United States. It's a very different time from today. And of course, he had the disastrous war in Iraq. And the Ukrainians, for domestic reasons, had participated in the occupation of Iraq. And George Bush was determined to reward Ukraine for its participation in the war in Iraq. And so he pushed this idea of Ukraine and also Georgia joining NATO. And maybe some of you remember the NATO summit in 2008 in Bucharest, where the Germans and the French said, no, we don't want these countries to join NATO, and George Bush insisted on it, and NATO made a very vague declaration that one day Ukraine would join NATO. They reached a compromise, and I would say this was sort of the worst of all worlds for Ukrainians, because on the one hand, they opened the door to NATO, theoretically, but there was no intention of following through, of inviting, of actually having Ukraine come into NATO. So it raised expectations among Ukrainians that one day that we can join NATO, whereas NATO did not have this intention. At the same time, it made Putin much more paranoid that this was actually a goal that was going to happen. And so at the time, most Ukrainians actually didn't even want to join NATO. It was a minority of Ukrainians who wanted to join NATO. But George Bush kind of pushed this onto the agenda, and it became kind of a burden that Ukraine would end up carrying for that time. I think the tragedy of Ukraine is that George W. Bush took interest in Ukraine for his own reasons. Then he left office. And after that, and this is really a tragedy, no American president was actually interested in Ukraine. Barack Obama was absolutely not interested in Ukraine. He was not interested in Europe. The US military was withdrawing from Europe. Barack Obama wanted to have his famous pivot, yeah, to China. He wanted to focus American foreign policy on China. He was uninterested in Europe and uninterested in the Middle East. Donald Trump was actually exactly the same. He thought the Europeans should solve their own problems. I'm talking about, of course, the first term of Donald Trump. He also said the Europeans should deal with their own problems. And he did not care about Ukraine at all. And when Joe Biden came into office 4 years ago, surprisingly, the Ukrainians had great expectations of Joe Biden because Joe Biden had been Obama's man on Ukraine. He had dealt with all the Ukrainian issues, and the Ukrainians thought, okay, finally we have an American president who understands our problems. But Joe Biden also had different ideas. He also wanted to pivot to China, and for him it was much more important what kind of relationship the US would have with Russia, because relationship was seriously damaged, and Joe Biden ignored Zelensky in the beginning of his term, and he was very interested in meeting Putin. And you might remember, or I'm sure you remember, the summit that happened in Geneva in June 2021. Zelensky was desperate to meet Biden before this summit, and Biden ignored him, and Biden didn't find time until later that summer. From the American perspective, and I think from Joe Biden's perspective, the idea was understandable. It was about keeping sort of a minimum of a relationship with Putin to avoid any greater conflict. And Ukraine was, again, not at the top of the agenda. This is the real tragedy. Vladimir Putin is telling the world that the Americans were, and he's telling Russians certainly, that the Americans were plotting to take over Ukraine and then as a next step go closer to Russia, when in fact after George W. Bush nobody actually cared about Ukraine. This was one of my conclusions. And of course I've been focusing on what the Americans were doing, but of course the Europeans were not any more sincere in welcoming Ukraine. Of course, there was the association agreement that the European Union was negotiating with Ukraine in 2013, but this was almost out of habit. Yeah, I mean, I tried to describe a little bit Europe in 2014 before the Crimea annexation. It was a very peaceful place, or it looked like a very peaceful place. The European Union looked like a very successful project. The European Union had won the Nobel Peace Prize, I believe, in 2012. And so there was this very feeling of comfort among many Europeans. Ukraine was far away, signed an association agreement. But again, this raised a lot of expectations among Ukrainians, among young Ukrainians who wanted to join Europe. And it also posed a geopolitical challenge to Vladimir Putin. The Europeans thought the European Union is a peaceful union and an economic union and creates and expands peace and prosperity. And Vladimir Putin's perspective was the European Union is a geopolitical rival that is also coming into our sphere of influence. I have only really one more point that I want to point out from my book, and then I'm happy to answer questions. One other theme which I explore in the book is the generational split that happens in Russia and also in Ukraine. So, as I mentioned before, in a lot of the new republics or the young republics that broke free of the Soviet Union, people didn't need a lot of explaining why they wanted to be free of Russia. But of course, in Russia, where imperial legacy was so strong, it was much more difficult, and I think it was much more difficult for young Russians also to break free of this older way of looking at the world. Still, it took place in Russia and in Ukraine, and I think this is one of the big misunderstandings that Vladimir Putin, when he began his aggression against Ukraine, was he did not understand that Ukraine had already, 20 years after independence, had already formed its own idea of statehood, and that a new generation of Ukrainians, even if they spoke Russian as a first language, they saw themselves as Ukrainians. They didn't, and as Ukrainian citizens, and not as belonging to any kind of Russian sphere of influence. In Russia, I also explore this generational gap, and as I mentioned, that's where I think the transition was the most difficult between generations. Vladimir Putin represents the old Soviet generation, and he represents a very specific subset, yeah, as I mentioned before, these security KGB officials. So they have a very specific way of looking at the war, of looking at the world. And Vladimir Putin never passed on power to the next generation. When Dmitry Medvedev, he was president for 4 years, he is of a younger generation, and people thought that maybe he would bring change to Russia. Now we see he is one of the biggest supporters of the Russian war in Ukraine. So that was of course not sincere. But other Russian opposition leaders, names like Mikhail Khodorkovsky or Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, they all presented some kind of a new vision of Russia that was very anti-Soviet and much more modern and much more forward-looking. These generations, of course, didn't have any chance. And I always tell people, and I also describe it in the book, that for me, when I was in Russia for the first time from 2003 to about 2011, and the second time I came when Donald Trump was elected the first time. And I tell people the biggest surprise for me when I came back to Russia, it was not that Russia was becoming more and more dictatorial. That's true, but that was not the biggest surprise. The biggest surprise for me was a new generation of Russians. So people who were born in the late 90s or even after the year 2000, who grew up in a relative freedom, especially if they came from larger cities, in relative prosperity. They had passports, they traveled, and of course, they lived in the internet like everybody else. And they were very connected to the rest of the world. And these people surprised me because in earlier years, I had always been struck by how different Russia felt from Europe or from the United States and other places. I had a very specific feeling. And when I returned to Moscow in 2016, I really felt like there was almost no difference in young people's attitudes and culture, you know, the culture, the pop culture that people consumed. And I think at the same time, it was the expectations that these people had of their own government and their own aspirations, even just in their personal lives. And they saw that clashing with an increasingly authoritarian government. So I don't want to be overly optimistic, but at the same time, I think there is this new generation, and that Putin really represents the most reactionary element now in Russian society, and he has truly usurped power. And once Putin is gone, there might be an opportunity. I would caution, though, of course, that we have no idea how this transition will take place. Transitions in Russia sometimes take place very suddenly. But there is also, of course, the possibility that someone from Putin's inner circle will take power, and that there will be some kind of continuation. But this, of course, remains to be seen. This is, in a nutshell, the the themes, and I think the main themes in my book. But I think I'm very happy to answer your questions. Right now, of course, my work today in International Crisis Group deals with the Ukraine war as it is now. International Crisis Group is an organization that studies conflicts all around the world. Probably any conflict in the world you can find on the website of International Crisis Group, large or small. And the idea, of course, is to do as much as possible to prevent conflicts before they happen, and when they happen, then to try to bring them to an end. So my job at Crisis Group, where I've been working since April, is studying what is happening now and what opportunities there might be for ending the war in Ukraine. So I'm happy to take all your questions. I think, Gilles, you wanted to start, right?
May I just propose a big applause? Thank you so much for this great presentation. First, I will limit myself to just one question, and we will see later. This question would be about the last weeks and the question of a ceasefire or peace in Ukraine, and what seems to be the key question of security guarantees. We know the French and the British are working on a plan. They try to do as if they had to act without the Americans, but they still think that it's necessary. They still speak about a reassurance. Trump has said no to NATO. It seems as if some noises say that Putin would say, okay, Ukraine in the EU, but we don't know. So what could be the future of a possible future if there is a ceasefire of these guarantees, and which institution or which coalition of countries could play a role?
Well, I think a lot of this right now with, what would a ceasefire look like, and what would even some kind of monitoring mission or peacekeeping mission, what would this look like? This is really the subject of a lot of speculation, and we don't even really understand in what context foreign troops would be sent to Ukraine. And I think problematic in these proposals is also the idea, what they call the backstop, the American backstop, that if something goes wrong, the Americans will always be there. They will not have boots on the ground, but they will always be there to help. And I think in some ways, the biggest problem, as you mentioned yourself, is that Trump has already ruled out this kind of backstop or American participation in this kind of security guarantee. So I find it problematic. Problematic from the way it has been proposed. But I think this is, the Europeans feel that they are now under pressure. They are obligated to present something. And now it's even after Zelensky's disastrous meeting in the White House last week, I think the Europeans feel that it is their responsibility to come up with something, and in some ways to save any peace process by proposing something to Trump. The problem in all of this is, again, the security guarantees, right? What kind of this was the crux of the matter when Zelensky went to Washington on Friday. And I tell people that what we saw, of course, if you watched this discussion in the Oval Office, it was very shocking the way it took place. This is not how state visits or visits between world leaders usually take place. So on that sense, it was very shocking. But I think fundamentally, the conflict between Ukraine and the Trump administration was always there. The Ukrainians are saying, we need security guarantees. Before they said we need NATO membership. Okay, they don't say it anymore because they know that Donald Trump wouldn't like that. But they still talk about security guarantees. And Trump said, no security guarantees. He said it also before. We knew even before this meeting that the Americans were not or the American administration was not ready to give any security guarantees. So this was, the whole world saw this conflict between Kiev and Washington come out in public. But in fact, this conflict was, the two conflicting visions were going to come out one way or the other. And I mean, now we're in a situation where the Europeans are rushing. I mean, they all sat down and worked on a Sunday, which is quite unbelievable, right? And they understand the urgency that now, if anybody is going to save this, save any peace efforts, then it will have to be a European plan. I think that, again, the other part that is so problematic is that the Europeans are also now find themselves in conflict with the Trump administration. And this is, of course, a very new situation for Europe to find itself competing and not on the same side with the Americans. So on one hand, they're not necessarily on the same team. There's this creeping feeling among Ukrainians and Europeans that now Washington is much closer aligned to Moscow, which is, of course, would have been an absurd proposition a few months ago. But now this is what we're looking at. So I think it's too early to say what they actually come up with and how their discussions go. But there are these conflicts that are at the center of between the U.S. and Europe and between the U.S. and Ukraine, which make it hard to imagine how they will reach a resolution.
Are there any questions? So should I go ahead? Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting and enlightening, and yeah, made you want to read your book. I have two small brief questions. First of all, I was maybe interested to know what kind of historical sources and material you used to have access to these types of information. And second of all, you briefly mentioned Trump's narrative on this conflict. I was curious to wonder how you view the Republican Party's and Trump's total narrative shift into a pro-Russian discourse. Is that only influenced by the fact that Trump may have personal interests in backing a Russian narrative due to older affairs that he had in the past, or is it due to the fact that there's a fundamental ideology shift in the Republican Party regarding Russia? I was curious about that.
So it's a great question on the sources. So I can also give you a little bit more background on the book. I mean, this is a book that I've been working on for probably more than 10 years, because I had the idea and was working on a book proposal and an idea already 10 years ago. And so I had a long list of people I wanted to interview for this book. I think there were several hundred people I wanted to interview. And when I finally, when Columbia University agreed to publish this book, I had a very tight deadline. And I realized at that point, most of my sources that I wanted to talk to were in Russia, which was, in the beginning of the war, inaccessible to me. Many of the sources, of course, were in Ukraine. And so I did the best that I could. First of all, I used my own research, since I had been reporting on all of these events myself. So I used my own reporting as a primary source. And I found that a lot of the characters in my book, they had actually said quite a lot in interviews, mostly in Russian, in the Russian language, but a lot of the key players had actually given extensive interviews. And I started watching these interviews on YouTube, and I was amazed how much there was already in the Russian language, also in Ukrainian, but mostly in Russian, and how little of it is maybe well known outside of, especially in the West. So that became I did have some interviews that I did, for example, with the former Ukrainian president Viktor Yushchenko, and a couple of interviews that just that were simple because the people were coming to Washington, but because of the time constraints, I mean, doing one good interview requires several days, you know, to prepare, and then also to transcribe and to understand what the person said if they said something new. And often people don't say anything new in interviews. They've said it already in 100 interviews before. So I relied heavily also on my colleagues' work. A lot of, I know most of the people who cover Ukraine and Russia for especially American and English-speaking media, also German media. So there were also I use this as source material, just what was covered in the press. These were the, I mean, it was kind of living history. There's my goal was to really to write the first book that would be a accessible and definitive account about the conflict, so that someone who does not know all the characters and all the places and all the history, that they could approach this book and still understand what it's about. There are a lot of names. I have a cast of characters in the beginning of the book, which is, I think, about 4 pages. And so if you're unfamiliar with the region, of course there are a lot of names. It is a history book. That was my first intention. As for the Trump narrative, this is one of the great mysteries, to listen to the way traditional Republicans were speaking about Russia even just 4 or 5 years ago, and now to hear Trump really doing a 180-degree turn. It's quite shocking, and there are so many theories. What is it about? What is Trump really trying to accomplish? Does he have personal interests? There are conspiracy theories about the Russians controlling Trump. It is you asked, is it a fundamental shift? It is a fundamental shift. I don't know if it's going to be the Republican policy going forward, but it is, because it is affecting U.S. foreign policy, it is absolutely a fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy. I think as long as Trump is in office, it will be a new direction. I tried to understand this relationship between Trump and Putin. It goes back to his first term in office, and I think Trump is attracted by the raw power that Putin shows. He controls all of Russia, yeah, and he is a strong leader. The way that Trump feels like he should be a strong leader. I think Trump also has the contrast to Zelensky, and it is my feeling that Trump does not particularly like Zelensky because there's the story of 2019, right? Maybe it was obviously a big story in the United States, but I think in Europe people also remember the fact that Donald Trump, when Zelensky won the election in 2019, Donald Trump wanted the new President Zelensky, to open investigations against Joe Biden and his son and their activities in Ukraine. And there was the famous phone call between Trump and Zelensky, where Trump asked Zelensky to please open these investigations. And as we know, there was also a pressure campaign that involved freezing American military assistance to Ukraine, to sort of force the Ukrainians to accept this. And we now know that Zelensky was ready to go on TV and say, yes, I will open investigations into Joe Biden and his son. And the only reason that this did not happen was because inside the CIA there was a whistleblower who heard about this phone call and raised the alarm that maybe this phone call was not 100% kosher. I think that was on the one hand. And of course, the US Congress also found out about the freeze in Ukrainian aid. So it came out into the public. And that's why Zelensky didn't have to make any declarations of investigations. But this, in my opinion, left a very, very bitter taste for Donald Trump. The Democrats started an impeachment process. He was impeached by the Congress. And so I think he associates Zelensky with this impeachment. And so, you know, it's a very negative association for Donald Trump to Zelensky, and as we know, still this very positive association that he has with Putin. Maybe one day we will know, you know, exactly the full story behind that relationship. But it is now, it is redefining American foreign policy, and the way that Donald Trump is handling the situation domestically. Traditional Republicans who are very critical of Russia are just keeping silent, and they're joining the narrative that maybe something is wrong with Zelensky.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm the Netherlands investor in Switzerland, and I've been following Ukraine with the new headers also for a long time for different positions. Thank you so much for your presentation, and very eager to get a copy of your book as well to read about it. With connection to see also the Iraq war, and those are very interesting angles as well. I think many of the things of you that you said about the history and background that I fully share. Going back to the current situation where we are now, the former American ambassador to Moscow, Minister Michael McFaul, just tweeted that, and I'm quoting here. We said, as ideologies, I no longer see any difference between Putinism and Marxism. That is quite something to say. But I think there is something fundamentally changed. And of course, I think it's in the industry to work to keep the United States on board and on our side in this conflict, because we need this cooperation. And that's a very tricky moment we're at the moment. And in fact, the year seems for very, I think, a good British, especially British diplomacy, the British-French diplomacy in the past few days to rescue the situation. The good thing about these developments that it's also, and we've been talking about Europe has to take responsibility, Europe has to get its act together about now the regional situation where we have to do it. So I think that's interesting to see, and to see how it will impact also with cooperation within Europe. A question to you, since you're half Swiss, what role do you see for Switzerland in this? Because I will say it's not just the European Union, it's also Europe now that together is so active. I'm very glad to see that UK taking its role, Norway taking its role. What role could you see for Switzerland there? And another, maybe not so positive question, but since you've been mentioned this, what are the chances that we will see a sequel to your book, Why Russia Invaded Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, whatever? Because is Putin going to stop with Ukraine? You're only focused on relationship to Russia and Ukraine, but doesn't it have a much broader?
Okay, those are great questions. Well, I think the role of Switzerland it's also important that Switzerland's role in Europe has changed because of the invasion, and the fact that Russia no longer views Switzerland as a neutral party and as a fair broker or an honest broker. And Switzerland is actually on a list of unfriendly countries, which was not the case before 2022, when Switzerland joined the EU on sanctions. So Switzerland finds itself, I think, in an very unusual situation. Switzerland, of course, as you all know, took part in organizing this peace summit in Switzerland last summer with the Ukrainians. But I think this was, again, very problematic from the point of view of getting all. I mean, the purpose of for me personally, the purpose of this summit was not exactly clear. And I mean, it was obviously the Ukrainians trying to do outreach to other countries outside of Europe. And of course, Switzerland, it's great that Switzerland stepped up to this role, but I think the Swiss also quickly realized that their role as a mediator was no longer being respected by the Russians. The Russians refused to attend this conference, and pardon?
They were not invited.
Right. Well,
Switzerland.
they were not invited, but they also had signals that they would not accept an invitation. And I think what's interesting for Swiss diplomacy is that you see now entirely new countries stepping up as possible mediators. Turkey is one of the countries that has really, in a diplomatic sense, and maybe not only diplomatically, has benefited a lot from this conflict. It's kind of played both sides. It supplies weapons to Ukraine and makes declarations of support to Ukraine, and at the same time maintains very close ties with Russia. Has not put sanctions on Russia. They are dependent on Russian gas. They get their gas through a pipeline, South Stream, the cousin of Nord Stream, through under the Black Sea. So the Turks have maneuvered, and of course now we're seeing entirely new players like United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia that are playing this role that maybe Switzerland in the past would have played. So it's difficult as long as the Russians are going to not accept the Swiss role. As for the sequel to the book, will the next book be about the Baltic, Putin's invasion of the Baltic nations? I don't want to go that far. I think what's important, people of course always ask me, do you think Putin is going to go, if Putin wins in Ukraine, will he go further? I do think really important to understand is that Ukraine occupies a very special place, not just in Putin's heart. I mean, I think for a lot of Russians, Ukraine that's our core, the Slavic core of, together with Belarus. Yet Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine are the core of any kind of empire. And so, and Ukraine, of course, also economically, as an agricultural powerhouse and also as an industrial powerhouse, plays a very special role in any kind of empire or expanded Russia. And geopolitically, it, of course, positions Russia much closer to Central Europe. So I think when we're talking about Ukraine and what Putin has written about Ukraine, we are one people, going back to all these historical references, it is a very special case, Ukraine. And that's not to say that Vladimir Putin does not have designs on other parts of Europe. But the way I see, for example, the danger for the Baltic countries are part of NATO. So they do have this protection, at least on paper. I don't necessarily foresee Russian tanks rolling into Estonia. I think what we might see, and especially with Donald Trump in the White House, is some kind of provocation or some kind of very, I don't like the expression so much, but I think you know what I mean, some kind of hybrid attack where it's not clear if it was a military attack. Was it sabotage? Was it something else? And I think these kind of operations might be stepped up against those countries which are very vulnerable. And it really poses the question of, when is it an act of war? If you turn off the power system for an entire country through a cyber attack, is that an act of war? So I think this gray zone, it's possible that Russia, especially if Russia succeeds or feels that it has succeeded in Ukraine, it might try some other, it might test NATO. And of course, with Donald Trump in the White House, there will always be the question, will the United States follow through on Article 5, on attack on one is an attack on all? Donald Trump has indicated that not all countries should maybe enjoy this protection. So I think there could be tests testing of the system. And if you're going to test NATO, if you're Russia and you're going to try and test NATO, I mean, this is of course the ideal time to do it when you have someone like Donald Trump in the White House who has, who has said that NATO is obsolete and doesn't seem to recognize America's role in the alliance.
I have two questions. One is an interesting remark that we haven't seen the generational change in the Russian society. Don't you think that there might be the effect of kind of mental re-engineering of Russian society, on genetic engineering, mental engineering, which is now submitted to over 100 years of Soviet propaganda? I mean, just means that the reasoning and values are different from in Western societies. So we kind of project our values and our reasoning on the Russian society, but it just works differently. And that could be one of the reasons why there is no change. And the second question, very different. Would there be a possibility of splitting Ukraine into two parts, because the eastern part belongs for a very long time in Poland? So maybe Putin is not after the whole Ukraine.
Okay. So the first question was about that we haven't seen generational change in Russia. I mean, my feeling is that Putin has not allowed. He has not allowed a new generation to take over. It is the same. It is really the same Soviet, and in some ways the most reactionary part of the Soviet society that is still running Russia. And I mean, this generation is getting older and older. And so my point was more that I do think a lot of young Russians, in the way that they view the world and even in their values, they have changed, but they're silent. They have been silenced, and we haven't seen them emerge. And I do agree. I know that there's also research out there about what has happened since 2022, and that there is a militarization, very strong militarization of society, and there's a youth movement that's associated directly to the army, and I think these tendencies are definitely alarming. But as we know from the Soviet Union, a lot of people did things in the Soviet Union because that was what was expected of them, and not because they were necessarily convinced. I don't know. It remains to be seen. I don't have this. I don't have a crystal ball. As far as splitting Ukraine in two countries, what's interesting is that in the Kremlin propaganda, also at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the Kremlin propaganda was often talking about, and now Poland wants to take back, the regions of Ukraine that it once controlled, and so it's an interesting idea. I think maybe the Soviet Ukraine was, after World War II, was actually was actually included part of what used to be Eastern Poland, right? This area around Lviv. Galicia was actually part of Poland, and that was kind of added on. Stalin kind of added it on. He gave it to the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. So there is this. Of course, there is the history of that, and in some ways, Kremlin propaganda was actually talking about a split like that. But I think Ukrainians have shown the world that they are a nation. That they are a distinct nation, that they're a distinct nation from Poles and Russians, although there are so many cultural ties. The question was, could Ukraine be split up, or?
Yes, if that could be one, kind of making the pill less bitter.
But who should decide this? Who should decide the splitting the country? I don't think anyone is seriously talking about this idea.
Perhaps related indirectly to this last question, at the very start, when the two Germanys, with the blessing of Western powers were allowed to reunite, there were big discussions between France, President Mitterrand, and the question was to marry Eastern Germany with the Soviet heritage, with the Western Germany with the democratic system. And linked to this basic question, Western Germany is part of NATO, but Eastern Germany is from the former Soviet Pact. The concession was, with the permission, let us say, of the warnings of President Mitterrand, okay, small Eastern Germany will unite with Western Germany in one Germany, part of NATO, but not an inch more to the east. President Mitterrand had given his agreement with a warning. It was a very well-known speech saying, gentlemen, remember one thing, nationalism means war. And he didn't explain more, but decades later, this with the Orange Revolutions, plural, this became, as all imperial state decaying, you have a surge of nationalism. And Mitterrand, liking history, remembered that Zaporozh Ukrainian revolution started with the protection of the Tsar of Russia. Without this protection, this will be part of Poland, as you just mentioned. So, of course, Europe is a very complicated history. Now, I ask you, if in Switzerland, a majority of the Swiss good friend and citizen of the French and Latin part would have decided with a huge majority, they are 60% of the population, and voting that it is forbidden to speak in parliament in production in French, what would have happened? We don't know, but it never happened. But probably the Swiss French or the Swiss Italian would have asked to join Italy and France. We don't know. But this is a bit what happened with the prohibition of equality between Ukrainian official language and Russian official language in a confederation. So would this have played a role in the start of the disconfidence and inamicable relation between freed Ukrainians speaking Russian and wishing to forget about Stalin, and Ukrainian full of hopes to create a new state, forgetting that centuries ago they were asking the protection of the Tsar and not Nicholas II. It was in the 60th century. So the history could have been different, and Ukraine, rich of its potential and culture, bilingual, and maybe even German was spoken, and Greek in Odessa, not speaking about Turks, of course, in Crimea. So I remain optimistic if a rational, optimistic study of reconciliation for a birth of Ukraine. But of course, Ukraine is a multicultural, enormous area, and it must be taken into account, this reality. So not from one bloc or another bloc, but a kind of enormous Switzerland. In that case, maybe Switzerland has a role to play, but maybe it's too late. You have the floor.
Well, I think the problem that Ukraine faced when it became an independent country in 1991 was that it found itself within the borders of the Soviet Ukrainian Republic, which then included included Crimea, which included former Polish parts, that included the very Russified East. And so, I mean, it was a problem of statehood, yeah, because how, and there was already separatism in the 1990s in Crimea, and it was a, so I mean, looking at you know, the way that that Switzerland developed over centuries and turned into a true confederation, Ukraine, and it was an organic growth of a country. Ukraine was just given these borders with very, as you say, very different populations living in it. So that became, of course, a challenge, and Ukraine chose the path of a unitary state, right? Especially after this, there was a kind of a flash of Crimean nationalism well, it wasn't Crimean national, Crimean, I should correct myself, Crimean separatism because they felt close to Russian. This, of course, also caused Ukraine to have a new constitution and to describe itself as a unitary state. So in that sense, a very centralized state, although unlike Russia, a very kind of weak centralized state, maybe also because it just economically didn't have the same draw. And so, you know, one of the narratives also in 2014 after the Maidan that the pro-Russian forces were pushing was this idea of Ukraine as a federation, not as a confederation, but as a federation. And this whole idea of federalization became almost, it was almost, if someone said federalization, it was almost as if they said they were pro-Russian, because this, again, federalization would have meant a weakening of Kiev as the center of the country, and a decentralized Ukrainian state, especially in such a weak situation. You probably would have seen separatism. I mean, it's the classic conflict, yeah, between a strong central state and a successful federation. I just don't think Ukraine, after its independence in 1991, had the ingredients to be, I mean, anything like approaching Switzerland. Also because, well, I mean, Switzerland has such a unique history, and I think there were also the economic disparities inside Ukraine. So I think on paper, Switzerland is a great model for a lot of multi-ethnic countries or large countries with different kinds of populations. But in practice, I think it would have been really difficult to execute.
We talk about Turkey. In Istanbul, April 20th, there was this seemingly peace agreement that was signed. We talk a lot about this. Now, what would be your reading about this type of agreement? Why it collapsed? If it collapsed really? And would it be a kind of a basis for future discussions?
So, there has been a lot of discussion about this. So once Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, quite soon after that, there was actually a negotiating track between the Russians and the Ukrainians to ending this. And there were a series of discussions that took part in Belarus and then also in Istanbul. And it seems like in April, there was already a draft or a draft of a draft that included a lot of interesting proposals. For example, Ukraine taking neutrality. That was and Russia accepting Ukraine's joining the European Union. Those were concessions that both sides seemed to have made. But if there were again, the sticking points were on guarantor. There were supposed to be, again, countries that would guarantee Ukraine's security, and there was a lot of vagueness, at least in the drafts that have been publicized, because Russia would have been included as one of the guarantor nations. And I mean, to me, that seems like a bit of a contradiction, considering that Russia had just invaded Ukraine. So this was one of, I think, the problems that the Ukrainians had with the Istanbul Agreement. And also on the constraints on the army. The Ukrainian army was supposed to be basically, as we say, defanged, right? It was supposed to become more of a sort of a paper or symbolic army. And I think these were two critical points for the Ukrainians. And I certainly think that the Russians are interested in going back to the this Istanbul document as a possible rough draft of a new agreement. But it's a big question if you know, the Ukrainians will want to go back that far. I mean, that happened almost 3 years ago, and so much has happened since then. I think first of all, we became aware of human rights abuses in the Russian-occupied areas, atrocities, apparent atrocities, and I think very significantly, since these Istanbul discussions, Russia has claimed for Russian Ukrainian territories to be its own, yeah, and has so as on paper annexed for, I say in paper because physically they don't necessarily control the borders of these administrative units, but for Ukrainian regions. And this, of course, becomes extremely problematic when the Russians say these 4 regions belong to us, and the Ukrainians say, what are you talking about? It will also create it will be also a legal, sort of a legal conundrum or knot to untie. So I can imagine that will be used as a basis, or that the Russians will want to use it as a basis, but I'm not sure at all that the Ukrainians, after all that has happened and that has been discovered since April 2022, if the Ukrainians really want to go back to that document. As we say, there are no dumb questions, and it's a very complicated conflict.
About what all was research on the. I was watching 1 year ago. The hearing of the LCT Commission, which I'm not sure is commission of the USA Senate talking about. I don't know if it's fun to know about that. Yes, there's, you know, it was about those reasons, the Senate those reasons. And so we're almost accusing reason to be the killer of the Putin system with, I don't know, $400 billion dollars, I believe, through Switzerland or something like that. I don't know if you're like, come on, about it. So
I'm not familiar with what you're talking. I mean, it was a resolution, or it was a
no. What just hearing the thing they did it. Well, I think it was 2 journalists and one singing lady. The lady was talking more about the contribution of Swiss industry to production of frequency in Russia, and the other 2 journalists were talking about economic aspect, how much money was going to Switzerland for financing Russia.
Like a mixed
Yeah, but that was one of the journalists was about that.
I think they just set a committee. In fact, there's certain down in Switzerland for not being proactive enough in its application of the European and US sanctions regarding Russia. I mean, criticizing the fact that there are still a lot of Russian assets in Switzerland that, yeah, they did.
Now, there was a case about the weapons, Swiss weapons still steps on the immigration.
Okay. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that. All I can say is tell you an interesting story. So on Friday evening, when I returned, when I came to Zurich, where I have my family, my relatives, on Friday evening, I had dinner with an aunt, and meanwhile in Washington, Zelensky was meeting Trump. I knew that the meeting was taking place. I didn't know what was happening. I had a wonderful evening with my aunt, and in a neighborhood restaurant, and at the next table, I recognized quite a well-known Russian oligarch having dinner with his wife, and I was surprised to see that. But on the other hand, I guess they also have to eat dinner. So.
You mentioned how you were struck by the young Russian generation and how they were similar to some maybe Western generations. I'm curious if you would have specific examples or anecdotes of how you may have the.
That's a great question, and so I do have an anecdote. In fact, when I returned to Russia in 2016, walking around Moscow, I noticed that on every street corner there was a barber shop, and so the English word barber shop in the old like Soviet Union or in the early post-communist Russia, they were all called parikmacherskaya, and suddenly they were barber shop, the English word. And these were really kind of hipster places. And I mean, I had to get my hair cut too. So I started going to one of these barber shops, and I realized, I met the owners of this barber shop, and going inside was, I mean, there was a lot of, it was based maybe on a Russian's idea of, a barber shop, but there was a lot of, they had video games you could play. It was the American style. You walk in, you don't need an appointment, loud rock, and the guys cutting your hair were completely tattooed. They had the craziest haircuts, the craziest piercing. And I did a story about it for the radio because I was so interested because again, it seemed to me that was one part of my surprise. I was like, this is young people are expressing themselves in a very similar way to young people anywhere else with tattoos, piercings, and so I began investigating this, and I also spoke to the owners. It was a young couple that owned this place, and they also said, well, the young woman who owned this barber shop explained to me they were very successful. They had a whole chain of these barber shops, and she explained to me. She said, well, in the Soviet Union, men were expected to be men and not care very much about their appearance, and this was considered very effeminate. And in the new Russia, there's just as in everywhere in the West, gender roles are being challenged, and young people were finding their own expression through their hair, through their hairstyles and through their haircuts and through the music that they use. I mean, like young people anywhere in the world, right? And it was this was very eye-opening, and it was also the fact that that men or young men didn't have to be worried anymore about getting some grooming. They had this couple also had a business in selling like all these lotions and all these things for your hair, and this was no longer seen as being effeminate. It was like do whatever you want, live however you want, and don't listen to any of these old stereotypes. And this was for me a big surprise, because the old Russia that I became acquainted with in the 1990s, it was extremely the gender roles and even the gender types were very, very stereotypical. I mean, I think these stereotypes made it all the way to Western Europe. That I mean, they're very old-fashioned in a sense. Yeah, that women almost always be beautiful and dressed as if they're going out to some to some ball or fancy dinner, and the men, yeah, you know. And this was no longer the case in Russia. I couldn't find a difference in with the way that young people were acting. And I mean, of course, a barbershop is a very small example, but I used the barbershop as a way of, you know, explaining a larger phenomenon. And of course, it has to do with the fact that the internet broke down all barriers. People in Moscow, young people in Moscow, they took their passport for granted that they could travel everywhere, and they felt very connected to the rest of the world. And I think a lot of these young people now feel very cut off. When I was there, I also did stories on music, yeah, the direction that music was taking. And what was really interesting is this was before the full-scale invasion, but there were a lot of Russian rap was taking off. I mean, there were these rappers that had, you know, millions of followers on social media that were extremely successful in their careers. I mean, rapping in Russian, doing rap battles. Also, I mean, there were rappers that were rapping in English and doing rap battles in English and in Russian. And the government at some point began cracking down on them because they were, you know, not propagating the right values, and they were being critical of the authorities. And Putin actually had a meeting with, I think, the youth, some youth committee, or anyway, and he was talking about how, and it was again a very Soviet, and maybe you could even say a KGB way of looking at youth culture. He said, well, you know, we need to be smarter. We can't just, it's stupid to, you know, forbid things. We shouldn't ban them. Instead, you know, we should try to bring them over to our side. And this I think is really a KGB idea of co-opting, yeah, bringing them to our side and using them for our purposes. So, and actually, since the full-scale invasion happened, we have also seen certain pro-regime rappers become very successful in their careers, or even more successful for following the government line.
In your view, are we moving towards the increase and the enlargement of a war, or towards a ceasefire?
Well, if the ultimate measure, yeah, of this conflict is it escalating or not escalating, then it seems like in the short term, I mean, if we're talking about the catastrophic escalation that people are fearful about, it seems like if there is some kind of rapprochement between the United States and Russia, maybe that is off the table. But we might see something, on the contrary, something much more local, because the way that Russians are portraying what's going on is, we're the peacemakers, Donald Trump is the peacemaker, and the war makers, or the warmongers, are the Ukrainians and their European allies. So, you know, in that sense, it might become a more, well, I was talking before, you know, some kind of provocations on the border. But a catastrophe, maybe we are farther in that sense, I mean, to answer your question, from some kind of nuclear escalation, if that's what you meant. Could be. I mean, this is, of course, it's speculative, but there's a different. What was frightening, I think, in the early days of the war, and especially when the Ukrainians were having successes on the battlefield in late 2022, was, of course, this fear in the American administration that it could lead to some kind of use of a nuclear weapon, as Putin felt more and more limited. And the fact that the Biden administration, in that sense, was not at all talking to the Russians. There was very little communication. Of course, we don't know what kind of back-channel communications there were, but there were very little communication between Washington and Moscow. And I mean, the only success there was this prisoner exchange that happened in August last year. But otherwise, otherwise there was very little contact. So at least there's the phone lines are very hot now between Washington and Moscow.
Right. Yeah, so if you look at the three options now on the table, there is a NATO membership for Ukraine, which is opposed by the South administration. At the same time, that state is willing to have a peace with U.S. guarantees, which is almost the same. I don't know what you're saying, but it's almost the same as a NATO membership. And on the other side, we have the proposition of that top organization to have just a ceasefire with no U.S. guarantees. Do you think that it's realistic? Like the Zelensky's proposition is realistic, and is the Trump administration proposition that you find?
That's a really great question.
I think one scenario I think that we could see in the next months or weeks or months is that there will be some kind of ceasefire, and maybe the Russians will actually stick to the ceasefire. And maybe even some preliminary peace agreement will be, at least from the American and Russian side, will be presented. And what I think is very important, or kind of a key moment, is I can imagine that once this happens, the Russians will say that the Ukrainians need to hold elections in order to legitimize the peace agreement, in order to have a newly legitimized leader who can actually sign this document. I think they will really, Zelensky will find himself increasingly isolated, not only by the Russians, but also by the Americans. And there will be this pressure for elections. This is a scenario I think is possible. And from the outside view, again, people will say, well, what's wrong with having elections? It makes sense. The Ukrainians should have a vote. Yeah. Also, if we're talking about a long-term peace, or what looks like a long-term peace agreement. The problem with the elections is, I mean, elections obviously are the bedrock of any democracy. But in the Ukrainian context, there are, even the opposition leaders agree, Zelensky enemies agree that this is not the right time to hold elections. I mean, the Ukrainian legislation also provides for suspending the elections. And the danger that people see is, how do you provide security during elections, even if there's a ceasefire? What if there's a ceasefire violation? What happens then? Zelensky himself asked, who among European election monitors or observers wants to go to Pokrovsk, which is a frontline city, which I think illustrates the dangers that are involved. You have 7 million refugees, you have displaced people, you have almost 1 million people under arms. So also, and you have, of course, occupied, territories where Ukrainian citizens can no longer vote. So you have all sorts of these technical problems. I did meet people in Ukraine that said we should have elections. There are not many of them, but some people have been saying that since the summer to me, that, well, let's have elections. I think the main reason, beyond the technical issues, the main reason people, including in the opposition, are opposed to elections right now are the fact that when you have elections, you open up the domestic debates. And up to now, Ukraine has shown real national unity in the face of this, in the face of Russian aggression. And I think as soon as you allow for elections, Ukrainian elections are very honest and open, and Ukrainians might start turning on them. On each other. Some people describe to me as a sort of a Pandora's box, and of course this would be an ideal moment also for Putin to intervene in one way or the other. And of course the Ukrainians could say, well, we don't want to hold elections in this case, and then, I mean, in some ways it could be a trap, because if the Ukrainians don't hold elections and the Russians are demanding it and the Americans are demanding it, well, then it looks like the Ukrainians are the ones who are undemocratic and uncooperative in this kind of system, in this kind of situation. So I do think it will be interesting to see if going forward if we will hear a lot more about elections. But you know, right now it's hard to even think about that because the whole premise of the peace talks is a little bit under threat right now because of what happened in Washington, right? This minerals agreement was supposed to open the way for a peace process with the Americans taking the lead role. And if that minerals agreement isn't signed, then it's hard to see how all these other steps happen afterwards.
Just ask you another question. It's a little different, but about how Washington DC people are looking at what is happening right now, because for the first time since decades, Washington and Moscow are supporting the same parties in Europe, extreme right, AFD, Germany, and so on. And for me, it's crazy when I think about it, that Moscow and Washington are supporting the exactly same party. How in Washington DC, same times, people are thinking about it?
Well, there's, I mean, obviously, yeah, shock. And as I might have mentioned, I had another talk today, so excuse me, I don't know if I'm confusing, but I arrived in, I just came from Kiev, and I arrived in Kiev right after the Munich Security Conference. So I kind of arrived in that, after the J.D. Vance speech and the shock that people felt there. What surprised me was, in some sense, the Ukrainians themselves said, well, they were surprised, they were very concerned, but they also told me, well, we've survived so many shocks already. We survived the annexation of Crimea, we survived the insurgency in the Donbass region, and the full-scale invasion. So in some sense, the Ukrainians were not so surprised. And they asked me, what is going on with American civil society? Where is your opposition? Where are all the Republican lawmakers who in the past always supported Ukraine? Why are they silent? So there's this feeling of real betrayal and a real doubt in America, in the sense that also, I mean, you've been telling us all these years we need to build a civil society, we need to build a strong institutions. So what's happening to American institutions? What's happening? Why is American civil society so silent? Why is the American opposition? Why are opposition politicians so passive? So it was. I experienced it in Ukraine. The last 2 weeks I experienced from a Ukrainian perspective, and I think there's a real disappointment, and I think people are wondering why I had a general who was telling us, all this time, we have to democratize, also to join NATO. So what are you doing? What's going on?
One more last question. Thank you very much for a great presentation and excellent discussion. I have a very simple question. Peace settlement, it looks clearly like Zelensky wants it. Does Putin want it? I'm not so sure.
You are doubtful that Zelensky wants it, or that Putin
Zelensky wants it. How about Putin? Because in a way, he's a war president and keeps him in power and glory in that Russia. That him fighting against the aggression of the Western nations through Ukraine.
This is a great question, and I mean, I also bring it up in my book that in some ways this conflict with the West, it gives Putin purpose, and it makes him, it strengthens him domestically, as when you have this external threat and a big external enemy like the United States. But of course, I think this is also beyond Putin's wildest dreams, where you have Trump now aligning himself, an American president aligning himself with the Kremlin. So that's not such a, I mean, that's not such a bad thing from the Kremlin's point of view, because one of the Kremlin's goals has always been to split the NATO alliance, and we do seem to see this real split. As far as wanting peace, I think both sides want a break. This war is extremely punishing for both sides, also for the Russians. I think Putin, because of the control he has over his own country, he can go much And because Russia's bigger, he can go farther. He thinks he can win a war of attrition, or at least to force the Ukrainians into some position. But I think for right now, I think Zelensky does want some agreement. But the problem is, again, that you have the clashing interests of the security. He wants the security guarantees, and Putin probably will not really stop until he has regained control over Ukraine.
I think we should stop now because we are a little bit already late. But really, Lucian, I would like to thank you so much for this presentation and for answering all our questions. And definitively, it has been a great moment. We've discovered new knowledge. We've benefited from your experience. And so I would like to thank you so much and say that in a few days we will put the video of this conference on the internet, and you will find the link on the website of the foundation. So feel free to speak to whoever may be interested about this topic, that he or she will find the conference available. Thank you so much.
Thank you.